start by saying that I spent 20 years or so in Alice Springs, and prior to that did my PhD and some work on the Eyre Peninsula. So I sort of know your region a bit and reasonably well, and I sort of know some of the issues reasonably well. But I mean, I need to say from the start that I didn't know quite who would be on today, and in any case, you obviously cover potentially a huge region. So yeah, I mean, don't hesitate to push back on me if I'm talking about some things which are not so relevant to you.
I think you might be on mute there, Mark.
Yeah, sorry. Are you hearing me okay now?
That's better. Cheers.
Sorry, something must have just clicked me over for some reason. Thanks for letting me know. That's good. Sorry, what I was going to say was it's good to hear that you've heard a bit from BOM and on the sort of climate trends recently. I will spend just a short bit of time on that, but I don't want to spend too long on sort of arguing about the exact levels of climate change, because the truth is there's uncertainty in that, but that shouldn't stop us doing a whole lot of planning for it. And I want to get into really talking a bit about some ideas about how one thinks about handling the long-term change there. And then I'll try to get into some slightly more concrete things that we can do as individuals and as communities, although, as I say, a bit of a disclaimer there for the diversity of things that you're going. And hopefully we won't fall down any deep shafts as we go. So, of course, we've always lived with change. And this is actually a set of photos from the photo points that I was studying from the 1980s, early 1980s, which I've been back to a few times on Middleback, or actually on Rupina, the northern part of that. And I mean, we all know that the landscape goes up and down, massive changes, and actually quite challenging then to pick out whether there's any sort of trends as opposed to just that variation from year to year or month to month. So we know there's been change, and it's not just in the environment, of course. I remember Port Augusta a bit like this when I used to drive over to my field sites, but of course in the last decade or so, you've had these extraordinary things going on there in the sort of southern end of the region with the solar thermal plant and then the opportunities that creates for things like the sundrop rather, all the hydroponics work there, the changes in cultural things and cultural recognition, all sorts of stuff that's going on, and of course many of those things open opportunities as well as creating challenges. But climate is one of those. I just got jumped right out. Hopefully you're still seeing. Yeah, so climate is one of those, and this is my sort of one graph of climate change that I'm just going to put up, which may hopefully resonate with some of the things you saw from the BOM, because this is off their site. This is one measure, a bit of an abstract measure, but it's the average mean temperature across the whole of Australia for each year over the last 100 years or so, and then and it's all relative. The zero there is relative to the period 1960 to 1990. So basically, the blues are going to be years which were below that 1960 to 1990 average temperature, and the reds are above. And you don't need any statistics on that to see where it's leading. It's clearly going up, clearly with lots of noise of that variability that I already mentioned, but it's really pretty clearly heading in one direction. And what brings it home for me is this is our eldest son, who's 33 now. He was born where that arrow is, roughly in 1987, and you can see that people in his generation, which may include some of you, I can't see, but actually have essentially never experienced a year in Australia which was below average in the long term. It's an extraordinary thing to think about, and people born in the last 10 years or so really have only experienced years which are very much above average on this sort of measure. And with that, of course, comes a whole series of impacts, things that we are seeing and statistically able to demonstrate now of these extreme summer temperatures, the potentially heavier daily rainfall quite often happening as a greater proportion of the total rainfall, meaning that overall the rainfall might be going down, but the extreme potential for flooding rains is increasing on average in different places across the continent. this extreme fire weather days also have increased already. We know sea level rise has already been about 1/4 of a metre, and that's continuing to happen. So what this really says to us is, in terms of trying to plan for what we're doing, we can't judge even today's risks on historical data, and we certainly can't think about future risks based on historical data, because it's simply becoming wrong for judging what we might do. Now, I imagine you may well have heard plenty about this, and I won't dwell on it, but those changes are echoed in your region, and there are various places you can go to look at that, whether it's on the SAAL website called Climate Change in Australia, which is quite a good place to get some sort of summary statistics, as well as a lot more detailed stuff if you want it, but there's some nice general descriptions there. And then there's the South Australian specific ones produced by the Goyder Institute as well at that website there. But we know then that basically we are looking at increase in average temperatures in all seasons, and in days above 35 degrees C, so increasing risk of heat waves there. In general, there's, I'm afraid, a decline in average rainfall, particularly in winter, and on the long run, more drought periods are gradually more likely as well. And then we get this increased intensity as the energy in the atmosphere increases. We get this increased occurrence of extreme events like high rainfalls, high winds, high hails, and things like that. Potentially harsher fire weather if you're in an area where that's significant. And again, if you're in, well, basically if you're in Port Augusta, I guess, sea level rise as well. And all of those things have flow-on effects in terms of heat waves and potential reduced water availability in aquifers, things like fires and floods, the changing ecosystems, and also direct impacts on infrastructure, things like the grid going down on that day a few years ago in South Australia. Where the extreme winds, which were larger than were the typical ones that the power lines are made for, where they occurred on 3 lines at the same time, and so on. Of course, flow-on effects on communities and economies. So the thing I want to say very strongly, though, is there are a lot of other changes going on as well, and all of those things sound horribly negative. Of course, some of them potentially can create opportunities if one's looking for the right angle on them, but there are also these extraordinary changes in technology. There's things that we've really seen this year, for example, the realization of the rest of the world that it is possible to work remotely in remoter areas, which hopefully might mean we see people perhaps moving back into rural regions. There is this incredible trend towards more accessible and cheaper energy, renewable stuff, which opens up opportunities for things like renewable desal. I think there's a changing engagement with First Nations worldviews, things like that, which have got interesting issues, interesting opportunities emerging from them, and then changing markets and so forth. And I'm going to come back to some of these things as we go. But all of that lot, just thrown at you in one go, if you haven't seen it all before, which I expect you have, I think one of the challenges is that it can seem incredibly disempowering and complex and all-encompassing. It's very much framed in a problem framing, I think, so people sort of see it as a threat rather than a more sort of balanced set of issues. It's also quite often framed very much as uncertain and very distant. And one of the things that I think the group that I've worked for in the past really tries to talk about is to try and shift that narrative. So trying to shift from talking about problems to talking about solutions and the decisions that need to be made, because we always have to deal with things in life, and this is just another set of them, and we shouldn't be overwhelmed by them. It's about decisions today. It's not about 2070. We have to worry about, as I'll come on in a moment, about some decisions which may have implications as long as 2070. But we're really on about how we make decisions today or in the next few years. It's not getting stuck on uncertainty. We deal with uncertainty in all sorts of walks of life. It's about managing that in a good risk management sort of way. And perhaps this is less so today, but in the past, climate change has been very much framed as an environmental issue, but it's really not. It's particularly a social and economic one. And so the question is, with that reframing, how can we minimize the sort of bad outcomes that might come from it and grasp at the positives? And that applies both in the mitigation side, reducing emissions, and in the adaptation side. And it also applies, by the way, not just to climate change, but to this whole mass of other aspects of change which are going on. And the key thing is that there are sort of systematic approaches to trying to think about this. always like this little cartoon. I don't know how well it's coming through on your screens, but the two sharks seeing the good news. You can always find the silver lining to the thing of being able to swim over there and eat them in a few years with sea level rise. So the first point, so now I just want to move into talking for a few minutes about 2 or 3 concepts, I think. So I don't want to be too abstract, but I think these are useful things to have in mind. And the first element of that is just to say climate adaptation, or in fact, I like to think of this much more as adapting to all of this package of change that we face. We're adapting all the time. There is nothing basically new about this. It may create some particular new interesting challenges and both opportunities and risks, but it's not as if we haven't forever repositioned ourselves as businesses to deal with changing conditions, or governments changing policies and programs, possibly too slowly sometimes, but to try and achieve change, to deal with changing conditions. So this happens all the time, and these decisions are taken all the time, often in the absence of, in fact, usually in the absence of complete information. So adapting to climate change is no different to that. The second idea, this is a bit more abstract, but I just want to put this up, which is we do tend to have a mental model that change is a disturbance, some sort of perhaps disaster or extreme event, and then things will return to stability again. I think increasingly people have recognized that maybe we have a disturbance and it changes still to a stable condition, but to a new stable level. But of course, I mean, if you live in the arid zone in Australia, or in fact in most places in the world, you have to have a different concept of change and managing it. It's actually managing ongoing change. The reality is that change is ongoing with climate and other things like technology. There's a little bit of directionality to it, which we need to think about, so that things can change in particular directions. But we have to get away from this idea that we just have a bit of a disturbance and then it'll all be okay, because we're actually managing the change, not the short-term disturbance. And that's quite a change in mentality, I think. And it means we do have to transform things at times. And along with that goes the idea that, you know, major transformations in society we think of as being really hard. But I always love this slide just to show that transformation can happen incredibly quickly. If you haven't seen it before, this is the Easter parade in Fifth Avenue in New York in 1900 on the left-hand side and 1913 on the other. So it's only just over a decade apart. And on the left-hand side, there are no cars. On the right-hand side, there are no horses. There's an incredible change in an incredibly short period of time. So once conditions get to the right state, it's quite possible for things to change quickly and for new opportunities to emerge quickly. And so a lot of this issue is about preparing for that sort of change and being ready to grasp opportunities. And if there's one thing that living in the arid zone teaches you, of course, it's to be opportunistic for when the opportunities do arise. So the other idea I want to leave you with is this idea of decision lifetimes, which you may have come across. And now I can actually call on a particular slide here, which is actually from, I was involved a bit in the Eyre Peninsula adaptation plan. I know you guys had done one a few years ago for your region too, and I'll actually come back to that in a minute. But I wasn't directly involved in that one. But this one was, and this was a graph of decision lifetimes that came out of the discussion at the Eyre Peninsula planning thing back in 2012. And it's trying to get at the idea that not all decisions are the same as far as change is concerned. So if you're choosing, which you may not be in this region, but if you're choosing something like an annual crop, you can choose that again next year and the year after. If you're setting up a fire management plan, you know, you can adjust that every year, or you can adjust it in 5 years' time, even if you just have a review occasionally. So the decisions you make there only matter. They only have a lifetime of a year or 5 years or so. So you don't need to be worrying about 2070 for those. As you start to look at some slightly longer term things, like perhaps new land purchases, which you probably wouldn't do if you weren't going to hang on to it for at least 20 years or so, you start to have a longer decision lifetime. And what you do now, you need to know that it's still going to work in 20 years or whatever time ahead. If as scientists we're creating new breeds, for example, doing variety production, that takes about 20 years to go from new breeding to breeding new varieties to actually getting them into widespread use. So the things we should be breeding today need to be suited to the conditions of 2040. There's no point making them for the conditions of today. As you get out to long-term, long-lived infrastructure like dams or major things like ports and wharves or something like that, then we're really looking at lifetimes of 80 to 100 years. And so we need to be thinking about what the conditions will be over that operational lifetime of the infrastructure. And sometimes some of those things, like, for example, peri-urban development, have implications which go on for much longer than the actual, that's the lifetime of this structure. If you put a suburb in place on a low-lying place, it's very hard to move it. So that's essentially an indefinite commitment, which you've got to then think about, perhaps if it really is in a place where it'll get flooded in 100 years. So this idea of decision lifetime is really important, because I think it immediately says there's a whole, that climate change is going to have, climate and all these other things are going to have implications for lots of our decisions. But some of them don't really matter, or at least we only need to think about the relatively short term in terms of change and climate. Whereas there are a handful, it's a fairly small number, but which are really long-term decisions which really need to worry about a much longer time frame. And there we do need to put more effort into worrying about preparing for future conditions. So that's encapsulated in this saying, today's decisions need to account for how long their effects will be felt. Now, we wrote this slide in 2012, I was interested to note, and so it's nearly 10 years later already. So you realise how quickly the time can slip by on these time frames, and why it is important to be thinking even on those 5 to 10 year time frames, because I think we've learned a lot more about climate change, and we've seen extraordinary changes in technology even in the last decade. And we'll see those continuing to happen in future. Trying to bring this idea of decision lifetimes into use is not rocket science. This was the graph that we put up on the wall for the Eyre Peninsula planning process, and it's sort of there's time along the bottom there, along the bottom axis, and a number of different drivers, impacts, sort of heat and sea level rise and rain up the side, and then decisions with different sort of lifetimes put out there. So in terms of just trying to structure your thinking, it's quite an easy sort of thing to do. Then it, in turn, intersects with one other idea I just want to put across, which is the degree to which, for the shorter lived decisions, ones which might only have a 10 or 15, perhaps 20 year lifetime, just out to 2030 or so, 2035, we can be pretty confident of what the climate's going to look like on that time frame, just as we can have a reasonably good idea of what the population might look like in Australia, or the I was going to say, or the economy, but that might be optimistic. And in fact, it's true that the economy is a lot less easy to predict than the climate is. But on that sort of time frame anyway, we can have a fairly good idea, and also we can take fairly incremental adaptation approaches on that time frame. As you get further into the future, we depend as to whether the climate recovers or stabilizes or perhaps runs away in the worst case. It depends more and more on what the world does collectively, whether we really manage to reduce the emissions into the atmosphere or whether we don't. And so the uncertainty there becomes much more one to do with social decision making and what society might do. And as a consequence, because we can't really identify what's likely to happen there, we have to increasingly think about being resilient to alternative futures. So if we really are thinking about ports and wharves out to 2070, 2090, then we have to be prepared to allow for significant sea level rise, because we'll certainly have some, but we don't know quite how much. And likewise, things like temperatures and changes in vegetation communities may be quite substantial, or maybe we'll be starting to recover the climate on that time frame, and we need to think about that. And that intersects with decision lifetimes like this. So if you've got a fairly short decision lifetime, one of these shorter decisions that doesn't imply things for very long, then we can have a fair degree of certainty of what sort of conditions we're dealing with, and we can plan much more confidently. With the longer term ones, we have to start worrying much more about being robust about it. So I'm going to come on in just a moment to how this might affect us in our sort of personal decisions and so on. Let me just say before I go on, those of you who've worked for the NRM organisations will know this, but this is stuff which is well codified, particularly for managing natural resources, but actually for other things too. There are various approaches to this in the Adapt NRM website there, as well as the If it's more on the sort of coastal side, there's another thing which takes the same sort of approach in there, but has more information about coastal side of things. So there's a lot known about how to go about this sort of planning process now. But now let me just have a sip of water. Let me shift now to thinking a bit more, still a little bit non-specifically, because I can't tell you exactly what's going on in your property or in your enterprise, but shift a bit more to the sorts of decisions and how one might go about thinking about these for my last few slides here. And let me talk about this firstly, thinking a bit more about the sort of personal or the family or the business, the sort of more individual sort of level, and then come on to talking a bit more at the community and regional level, of course the two interact. And at the personal level, let me talk a little bit about the sort of shorter time frame things. And obviously there's no strict boundary here, but in a sort of exemplary way, some things which are shorter term, more that 10-year time frame, as opposed to the longer sort of 30, 25, 30, 50 year time frame, which is perhaps more a sort of legacy or property succession or regional level time frame particularly. And part of the thing here is to recognise that those shorter timeframe things are often about ongoing management and the general sort of viability of a property, similar sorts of things for tourism enterprises or for managing nature conservation and so on, or mines, in fact. So on that sort of timeframe, we know it will be getting slowly hotter, and there will be a slightly higher risk of drought and flooding and perhaps fires if you're in places where that matters, and sea level rise if you're in Port Augusta. I think, though, those will be happening. They'll be there in the background, and certainly something one wants to be aware of. But probably on this time frame, the sorts of decisions you're making which have got that time frame, there are other things which will have bigger impacts, and which perhaps open opportunities to be doing things that deal with the climate aspects. So markets, I think, for example, are going to be demanding more. There's more and more pressure coming in, as you know, on the sort of social license to operate issues of whether it's the sort of live export or whether it's animal welfare during droughts and so on. So, I mean, pressures from that sort of thing, but also opportunities from markets because globally, there's no doubt that demand for livestock products isn't going to go backwards. Whatever I mean, I'm fairly vegetarian myself, but meat demand is just going to continue to rise. I don't think there's any doubt of that. There are all these technological communications and other technologies, renewables, opportunities that emerge from that. And again, you probably keep track of those much better than I do these days. But it is really worthwhile knowing what's coming out there, because there are opportunities for those to be integrated into management with all the sort of remote monitoring and so forth. And I think there are opportunities then in natural resource management to be looking at how to make, in the relatively shorter term, how to make landscapes more resilient. It doesn't happen overnight, of course, but making those landscapes more resilient will help to buffer the impacts of any climate change that is happening during that time, and also set the whole system up better for the longer time frame. And may well offer some new income streams in terms of things like carbon farming in that time, whether you think of it as regenerative agriculture or carbon farming or nature tourism, or how you integrate that with energy systems for a bit of diversification and so on. So, I mean, I think there are some exciting things there, but they're not necessarily exactly what one was used to do in the past, and I'll come back to that in a little while too. As you go to longer time frames, and as I say, there's no hard line here, but I think we are starting to think more about the decisions that really have a 30+ year time frame in day-to-day. They're not generally the day-to-day management ones. They're the ones where you're actually deciding to make a dramatic investment in property sustainability, or where you're really thinking about property succession perhaps, and how you're going to leave the land in better condition for the next generation, or perhaps how you're engaging with the regional planning processes, which we'll come on to in a moment, in order to set your enterprise up most effectively in that. I think issues around enterprise diversification, which I mean is often said, but and particularly thinking about how you can create resilience in that by having different parts of the enterprise which respond to different things. So some which are unaffected by drought, some which are perhaps unaffected by market downturns, some of which perhaps, or at least by the stock market downturns. and others which are in general being driven by different factors, so that you've got something that's delivering at any given time. And this whole issue of being able to pass on land which is in good condition, so that it's more likely to be able to earn in whatever future changing economy comes to pass. I think these are the sorts of things that one's thinking about in these different sort of timeframes, although I'll be interested to hear other people's views. As you go up, what's pretty clear, though, is that all of that has to happen a bit within the context of a sort of community and regional level, where other things will be happening. I mean, there will be shifts in economic base, there's probably threats to tourism and regional population decline and so on, although perhaps not necessarily. I think there are opportunities, again, the same sorts of opportunities that are playing out at that regional level, whether it's in renewables or carbon farming, or this recognition that maybe not always having to live in a city is a good thing, and that perhaps we'll see more people come back out. And really thinking about the things at that scale, I can't do better than to pull out the cross-cutting priorities, the longer decision lifetime sort of issues that were raised in your own Far Northern, I guess, adaptation plan. This is a list of them. I mean, I won't go through them in detail, but I think they're actually a really good list. There's a group there at the beginning which are very much about governance and engaging people and building people's capacity, engaging the community's capacity to take everyone's views in. There's a group which are more about sort of physical infrastructure and making sure that that's ready for climate, but actually you could put in some other of those changes in here as well, whether that's in the sort of roads area or energy road or energy area, or the communications and service delivery side of things. And then clearly also this issue of looking after the land across the rangelands. And I see these echoing really nicely sort of themes of building resilience, building social resilience in those first few, building physical resilience and infrastructure resilience in the next block, and building the sort of more environmental capital side of things at the bottom there. And that's really important, but it is true that many of these longer term, larger decisions you can't really do as individuals. It's got to be coming together as a community with government support to try and drive these forwards. And so things like that plan, which I hope isn't just resting on a shelf, but is actually getting implemented, are really important for that. Now, I've just got so 2 or 3 more slides here, but and the next one I want to put in, but I think it is quite a challenging one, and I debated whether I hesitated whether I should. But I think there's a big and very challenging question, which applies to all of us, whether you're living on the coast or somewhere else, in the context of changing conditions. And it is to ask yourself whether you're living there primarily because of the place and the community and the culture and the lifestyle, or whether you're living there primarily and in order to live there, you're doing a particular business or livelihood, or whether you're living there because of that livelihood, business, and your experience in that, and because you're pursuing that livelihood, you end up with the place and the community. Because if you're really there for the place, then in the face of change, and climate change is one of these things, but it's actually in face of all these other changes too, then I think one really has to think about how you modify, adapt to that livelihood over time in order to be able to keep living in the place. If, of course, it's the livelihood specifically, then one has to keep reflecting from time to time about whether this is the best place to pursue that livelihood in the long term and apply your experience in that and interest in that particular business. So, and I think that's quite a challenging question for people. It's one I've had discussions with pastoralists around the country about from time to time, but it is an important one to sort of make explicit and ask about explicitly. And I think there's a number of issues that one can bring to bear in thinking about that. There's the aspects of personal lifestyle. It is going to get hotter and drier. I don't think that's. I think that unfortunately is inevitable, especially on those longer time frames. But it has to be said that people have thrived in drier places than the SAAL region forever in different areas around the world. So it's not impossible to do it. It's just not going to be quite the same conditions as today. It's very possible, and in fact becoming increasingly possible with some of those technologies. There's no doubt the landscapes will change as those conditions change, but that just shifts the question more into how to maximise their resilience and maintain the values that people have in those landscapes as they do change, and also to look for how that might be creating new livelihood options. There's a community angle to it. I mean, there is a risk that people will continue to leave, but there are people who want to live in outback Australia, and really collectively as a society we should be supporting people to do that and look after the country out there on our behalf collectively. And COVID, I think, has actually shown that good communications can help that happen better. And then there are, of course, livelihood and business aspects to it too, and I've already said enough about the fact that technology is opening opportunities there. One thing that can't be avoided, though, is that there are success factors in achieving sort of long-term visions as a community, or actually at any level, even as a family. One is leadership. That's clearly an important thing, having leaders that can see this and can carry people along. The second is visioning that brings, whether it's the community or the business's workforce or even just your own family, along with where you want to go. It's really important to have that vision and to discuss it openly. The third thing is you do have to have practical options. So I mean, it's important to keep on top of what options are around and keep an eye out on what other people are doing and experimenting with. And then you have to have, the other thing that you commonly find as success factors in organisations is you have to have support in the organisational executive. Now that might be key people in the community. It might be the senior management in a business, or it may just be the adults in your family or whatever. But it is important that the leadership is coupled with that support. So in conclusion then, just a quick sort of summary of a few key points there. Change is the only certainty. I think we all know that, and climate change is just one aspect of that, really. I think it is a truism that these things create as much opportunity as threat. So it's just much easier to think about the threats because that's the thing that changes today's operations. We do need to think through, we need to think about how it affects decision making now. And so just avoiding this temptation to worry about what things are going to look like in 2070 and then say, oh, I'm not going to be making any decisions then anyway. To come back to really think about how it affects decisions today, and a few of those decisions, not very many of them, will have long-term implications. We know climate change will drive a series of things, but there's also lots of other changes that are going on, some of which also will create challenges, but some of them make opportunities. And I think there are important decisions at both the individual and community level, and it's useful to think at both of those and to think at a couple of different timeframes. And behind it all, I do see this, vision, leadership, and so on is really important in that. And I do see this key need to build social, economic, environmental, and individual resilience, which often our current economic system undermines all of those things. But so keeping a firm eye on them does enable us to keep pursuing those. So with that, hopefully with a good sort of optimistic, forward-looking sense like these poached egg days is, it's over to you, and thanks.